Welcome to the Real Python Podcast. This is episode 227. Have you wanted the flexibility of f-strings, but need safety checks in place? What if you could have deferred evaluation for logging or avoiding injection attacks? Christopher Trudeau is back on the show this week, bringing another batch of PyCoders Weekly articles and projects. We discuss a set of recent Python Enhancement Proposals, or PEPs. The idea of template strings has been under consideration for a while, and PEP 750 describes a new way forward. PEP 759 proposes a way for projects on PyPI.org to safely host resources on external sites using a new package upload format called a .rim file. We share several other articles and projects from the Python community, including what didn't make the headlines about Python 3.13, solving Sudoku with Python packaging, what is sweet about Python syntactic sugar, database-generated columns using SQLite and Django, a discussion about mentoring, an adaptive web scraper, and a debugging tool for HTTPS client requests. This episode is brought to you by Sentry. Fix application issues before they become downtime with Sentry error and performance monitoring for Python. All right, let's get started. The Real Python Podcast is a weekly conversation about using Python in the real world. My name is Christopher Bailey, your host. Each week, we feature interviews with experts in the community and discussions about the topics, articles, and courses found at realpython.com. After the podcast, join us and learn real-world Python skills with a community of experts at realpython.com. Hey, Christopher, welcome back.
Always nice to be here.
All right. So we got a little bit of news, right?
Yeah, just a tiny little piece. And in fact, this one popped up just a couple hours after we recorded 2 weeks ago.
Okay.
Python 3.14 Alpha 1 is out. So, yep, 3.13 is barely out the door and 3.14 is now a thing. So it's time to try your Python Pi. I'm predicting at least 314 Pi and math-based puns between now and the release in October of 2025. So get used to it.
Yeah, it's a requirement. Well, that gets us right into our topics this week. And we have been featuring a variety of articles and things from our friend at ByteCode and the newsletter/blog there. Last year, we talked about what didn't make the headlines in Python 3.12. And so now ByteCode has a what didn't make the headlines in Python 3.13. So a handful of things. There was a very gracious mention that if you would like to see the things that are the headlines, that you might go and check out the Real Python article that was done by Girana. So a nice link in there for us there. So thanks. They start out with features to improve PDB, which I know we talked just briefly about. Their feature, you are entering immediately with breakpoint, that fixing a bunch of kind of issues as far as working with the debugger. But there's a lot of other goodness included also. A lot of the REPL changes are now in PDB. Also, the multi-line editing, code completion, accepting dotted paths, support for PDB and zip apps. So a bunch of stuff in PDB. And ByteCode argues that this is a very good reason alone to upgrade to 3.13. They mention some stuff about shutil, file system operation updates. I know that we kind of dug into a little bit in our overview there, things working in a more recursive manner. Some stuff that I didn't hear about, concurrency updates to how several async IO methods operate and an increase in the multiprocessing pool, max number of workers. So a lot to dig into there. I really like how they are connecting to much of the original documentation as I try to do in my show notes. But here there are so many little changes that you can go and dig into the documentation or the message threads or the error changes and so forth if you want to learn a little bit more and drill into them. He mentions a few disappointments, performance not being a big change in this version, which we talked about a little bit ourselves, that they're really kind of laying the groundwork for other possibilities with the JIT and the GIL removal if you want to experiment around with that. We talked about the garbage collector and things that happened there and that change being reverted. They mentioned a few things that are at the time broken. I feel like a lot of those things may be fixed in the next couple of updates. And then they had a few sort of nice little random things. The venv command, if you do python-m venv, it adds a .git ignore file, which I think is kind of cool. And so automatically ignoring the venv, which is nice, the virtual environment. It's a nice wrap up to check out. So I wanted to include with that an article that came out shortly after that, which is kind of a wrap up for October. It's titled What's Up Python? 3.13 is out, T-strings look awesome, and dep groups come in handy. So again, kind of a bit of a newsy wrap-up thing. And so they mentioned the 3.13 stuff that we've already dug into. And then this template strings proposal, which is PEP 750, and I'll include a link to that. It's very detailed. It's actually one of the things I'm impressed with in the PEPs lately, of them providing lots of different, not only like, where we are, where we're going, here are examples of how to use it and so forth. This PEP has been a long time coming, this idea of how can we get some of the functionality of F strings that people like so much, but be able to do that with templating, which is still being done in other ways. And I guess people are going to maybe call them T strings, template strings. And probably the easiest way to think about them maybe right away is F strings are evaluated immediately, or eager. We talk a lot about this in the data frame world, this eager evaluation versus lazy evaluation. And T strings would be on the other side of that, would allow for a lazy evaluated string, which in a lot of circumstances that's needed. And so they give examples in this. Deferred evaluation would be great for translation of a document, or logging, or escaping out things and avoiding injection attacks like SQL and shell or JS injection. I'm impressed with it. It should be an interesting thing to kind of watch that space. And the other PEP that is mentioned in there is PEP 759, which is about external wheel hosting. It's not so much about third-party PyPI instances or private indexes, but it's more about having a custom spot or download, like kind of a link on PyPI, so that projects that host really large libraries, something over like maybe 100 megabyte per library or 10 gigabyte per project, could potentially link out to that information and not really crush PyPI with the bandwidth costs of having to host all those types of things. And this is that Dockerization of some projects that are these huge projects. It's an interesting idea. They have a new term for it, a format that they're calling a .rim or RIM file, remote installable metadata, which is basically like a wheel file with all the Python code is removed, and then an external hosting JSON file telling you where to find the real code. Neither of these PEPs are accepted. They're kind of still in discussion mode, if you will. There are links there, not only to the PEPs describing what's going on, but also then a link to the discussion. Actually, one more PEP, PEP 735, which I think we maybe touched on briefly, the dependency groups in PyProject TOML. I just did a review of a course that's going to be coming out soon on Real Python about poetry, and this seems to be maybe lifted a little bit, or at least inspired by how poetry does this. It's when you're wanting to set up a project and you want to have resources that shouldn't be just installed for everybody. They are like maybe development dependencies or testing tools and so forth. You can declare those things, and it provides ways to sort of structure that tabular way of doing stuff, these tables that are done inside of a PyProject TOML. And the last thing that's mentioned in this article, news-wise, is MyPy 1.12. It's supporting new generic syntax, and this is a typing change that happened in Python 3.12 that you might remember. There's a good refresher there. If you're interested, MyPy supporting it is nice, kind of moving forward. Thanks again, Bytecode, for this nice news wrap-up that I can kind of reference here. And again, I really appreciate all the links to much more details if you're interested.
There's been a lot of work ongoing with the template syntax stuff. So if you happen to have gone through the PEP a few weeks ago, you can go through the PEP again, because they almost rewrote it. There's been a lot of discussion on it. So they just did a massive commit a few days ago, updating the PEP with some new ideas. So it's very much something in flux, but it looks like it's starting to settle down.
Well, it would be nice, because everybody wanting to have that sort of formatted string feature for something like logging or these other situations have had to use the other format. And so the idea of just changing it to a T in front of your formatted string to be able to get this evaluation is going to help. At least people will be familiar with the syntax and how all that stuff's kind of lined up.
Yeah, no, I agree. I think it's a good idea. And some of the stuff in the original PEP made me sort of go, and then they got rid of all the stuff that made me cringe. So it was like, oh, okay, all right, good. We're getting to a reasonable place. Excellent.
Fix application issues before they become downtime with Sentry error and performance monitoring for Python. Whether you're taming Python's processing power or controlling JavaScript's flow through Node.js, backend infrastructures are as complex as they are valuable. With Sentry, you can trace issues from the front end to the back end, detecting slow and broken code to fix what's broken faster. Within minutes after installing Sentry, software teams are able to trace Python issues back to poor-performing API calls, as well as surface all related code errors. To fix what's broken faster, one engineering leader that used Sentry said, the time to resolve errors went from days to minutes. Installing is easy, and new users get 3 full months of the team plan, free with the code Real Python on sign-up. That's Real Python with no space. Learn more at Sentry.io. So what do you got for your first?
I've got a quick one. It's a little odd, but interesting because it's odd.
Yeah.
So it's a post by Simon Wilson talking about a new package from a developer who goes by Consti, spelled Konsti, on GitHub. They've used package management tools to implement a Sudoku solver. So how this works is you create a text file that represents a Sudoku puzzle. You can do this in 3 different ways. Way number 1 is to create a CSV file. So for example, for a 9x9 grid, there would be 9 lines in the CSV, and each line is a comma separated value with a number for cells that have numbers in it and an underscore for those cells that are the ones you're trying to figure out in the puzzle. You can then use a script that comes in the package called CSV to requirements, which converts this CSV into a requirements.txt file. Which leads me to way number 2, which is you can skip way number 1 and just specify the requirements.txt file yourself. So how the requirements file looks is each cell that has a number gets specified as a package named Sudoku underscore row underscore column. So if you're trying to put 5 in row 7 column 2, that gets represented in requirements.txt as Sudoku underscore 6 underscore 1 double equals 5. So row and column specifiers are 0 index, so hence row 7 becomes 6. And then the third format is you can also use a pyproject.toml file with the dependencies list filled in using the same format that I just described in requirements.txt. So once you've specified what your board looks like, you run pip compile, or if you're using UV, you do UV pip compile, and output it to a new resulting requirements file. And it requires some other command line flags, but I'll skip that because reading out command lines in podcast is a little dry.
Yeah.
And the end result is essentially a solved board using that same Sudoku row column equals thing that I talked about. There's also a script in the package called render solution that takes that requirements file and spits it out as a CSV, so you can go full circle and read out what it looks like. All of this, of course, begs the question as to why, but
Right.
Let's just go with why not as the answer. And if you're interested in what kind of things you can do to hook the project management tools, well, it turns out it's a full programming language, and you can do anything you can do in a programming language as part of your compile step. And so this kind of shows you that that's possible.
Fun.
It also showed me that I don't know how to spell Sudoku. I think I spelt it 3 different ways in 2 sentences. But besides that, that's...
Yeah, I was just correcting some of it in the article here in the summary. You can always remember the O is in the middle. Yeah, that one's kind of hard. Sudoku, yeah. My next one, I had Brett Cannon on the show a few times. Back in episode 47, we talked about unraveling Python syntax to its core. And then back in episode 92, he came back to kind of continue unraveling Python syntactic sugar. And so when I saw that Lay It On Esposo Ramos had written an article that was very specifically about syntactic sugar, why Python is sweet and Pythonic, I decided, okay, well, that might be kind of fun to cover. It's very much a listing of all the different ways that Python uses syntactic sugar across the language and different techniques and so forth. And I think it might be a really good guide for someone coming from another language and looks at Python and goes, okay, well, what is all the funky stuff that's going on inside of it? What is the different formats of these syntax and how is it laid out and so forth? If you're not familiar with the concept of syntactic sugar, these are pieces of code or the syntax of the language, and they're meant to sort of simplify it. In some ways, make it more readable. In other ways, make it more concise. Most languages do this. I feel like there are obvious changes that most languages do, like let's use the plus symbol to indicate addition. In the case of Python, Leidos goes into the very, very detailed stuff that's actually happening under the hood. This is where you need to get your finger on the trigger here, Christopher. Everything in Python is an object.
Thanks for the warning. I was half asleep.
So there are special methods that are implemented to do this stuff. So in the case of the plus sign, there is a special method under add that happens there and so forth. And so by default, when you create your own classes, that's something that's not there. You would need to actually implement that to have that. And so this kind of gets into that a little bit, and you kind of understand a little bit about the building of the language, but also a little bit of building of objects and so forth. How does Python use this? Leidos takes you through each of the constructs and syntax, operators, starting with that. Those are like the plus, the minus, all the typical stuff for like, okay, how do you do division? And then we get into conditionals like greater than equals. A few of these things, I definitely had that question when I first started learning Python, and I really wanted to do video lessons and teach these kinds of concepts because I felt it would really help me learn them. And so one of the big ones in my case was decorators, but also F strings, going back to that, like I didn't quite understand what is this syntax and how does this work? And so it was a very early one that I wanted to learn. So I did a course about F strings, did a course about decorators using the @ symbol and kind of how that works. So it helped me understand them more. And you might have your own. Like another one that was odd to me also was unpacking the asterisks that was used for things like unpacking a set of arguments. You might see the common structure of ARGS, args, and then KWARGS or keyword arguments. I still like calling them args and quargs, but you might see the star there or the double star for that. So this article really digs into all that stuff, areas of interest that are going to be different for each person. You might be like, okay, well, what is this thing called yield and how does that work with a generator and what is the with statement? And so a real good tour of that stuff. What Brett was trying to do is slightly different. He really wanted to know more about breaking the syntax down to what are the core elements that make up Python and its language in his series that he did on his blog. And partly why he wanted to do that was he wanted to know, like, what is the minimal viable language components that all the other constructs in Python are made out of. And partly why he wanted to do that was he was looking at WebAssembly and making a small version of Python that could be implemented in it. And so it kind of goes back into this idea of like, what's there. He created a presentation that sort of summarized all this stuff, presented it back at PyCascades and PyCon. And I'll include a link to the video, probably the PyCon one. You can also listen to my conversations if you haven't gone back in the past and listened to my previous things. We talk about the WebAssembly, WASM, and Pyodide. And most recently, the episode that just came out a week ago talked quite a bit about this with PySheets and how that's being implemented in Pyodide. And now MicroPython, which is, again, that really kind of the idea of that, like how can you get just this core elements of Python and then run them in the browser. So
I have two questions for you.
Go ahead.
One, should we add a sound for every time somebody says something about typing in Python? And given it's my soundboard, can it be something negative? And like, two, wah, wah. And two, more importantly, is there a piece of syntactic sugar that you like a lot or couldn't live without?
So right now, I definitely, all the standard operators, that's like a no duh. Like they kind of have to be there, like plus, minus to me. Like I would really not like to have to write them. And you can see in the article how this is done. You'd take a number and then you'd say in parentheses dot dunder add, or whatever. And I feel like that would be rather confusing and kind of slow. But decorators are one of my favorite constructs in Python. And now that I understand them, I don't think I would want to go back. And F strings are another one as far as it goes. I don't know if that quite fits entirely the syntactic sugar thing, but
well, it's the same with the operators. Like the operators are syntactic sugar in Python because they designed them to be that way.
Right.
They're not in a lot of other languages. So they could have made the language choice to have plus just be plus. It didn't have to be because of the word
objects. Yeah.
I think for me, it's probably the with and the context managers.
Sure. Context statement. Yeah.
It's one of those things that I remember discovering in other programming languages, using constructors and deconstructors in order to automatically clean things up because it's so easy to forget to do something like close a file, right?
Yeah. Yeah.
And this just makes that so much cleaner and easier. And it's easier to read, but it also makes your code more bulletproof, which to me
that's a great plus. Yeah.
That's the right choice, right? Like that helps you know you're making the right choice.
Yeah, I mean, it does so much. It's very interesting. I mean, decorators are kind of similar in the way that there's like this whole like sort of setup phase and tear down phase that is so behind the scenes now, which is really nice. It's nice when the language is, well, I think you said it already earlier, this idea of like, can we minimize the amount of things that you need to type, but in this case also, protect the users from making dumb mistakes, I guess. I don't know what else to call them. So
yeah.
So anyway, I think it's a good resource. I don't know how easy it is to read through per se. There's a few of those resources that we create sometimes on Real Python where they cover so much. And so it's one of these things where I think you maybe come back and forth to it.
I think it works as a good springboard. It's like, I didn't realize that worked that way. I'll go dig into, right? I'm going to find something else. Yeah.
Right. And he includes the deeper resources on almost every one of them, which was nice. So if you're like, oh, okay, I think I kind of get what there's being explained here in this paragraph. And it's like, okay, well, here's an entire tutorial that goes much deeper into it, which is kind of like what Real Python's all about, which is, again, a good resource. So what's your next one?
I've got an article by Paolo Melchiorre, and it's titled Database Generated Columns, Django and SQLite. It's a little over a year old now, and it's talking about a feature that got added in Django 5.0, and we're already on 5.1. But it's a really good intro to this feature, and it made me go from, why do I need this, to, hey, this isn't a bad idea. Thank you, sir. So first off, just a quick reminder about the Django ORM. Inside your code, you write a class with fields to describe what you want in the database. Django then creates the appropriate tables and columns based on your class declaration. So for example, if I have a person class with a first and a last name, I specify two fields as attributes on the class, both of which use the char field Django class, which means they're going to be stored as characters, hence the char. And Django then creates a table for that person with 3 columns, number for an ID, which is automatic, and then one for each of the first and last names. Different databases have different quirks, so Django attempts to abstract this away from you, and it just does this underneath for you. So Django ships with all sorts of different fields, including several for text, different kinds of numbers, booleans, relationships between different tables. And Django 5 added one called the generated field, and it works as a dynamically set read-only value. So you specify a generated field by giving an expression, and that expression is what determines the contents of the column. So back to my person example, if I wanted to have a full name field consisted based on the first and last name, I could use a generated field to do that. I shouldn't. Using first and last name is a horribly westernized way of storing your data, and naively combining them into full name just doubles down on that mistake. But that's a tangent about how to store people's names and has nothing to do with the field's capabilities. So anyhow, Paulo's article goes through several different examples of how to use this generated field, including different kinds of expressions that you can take advantage of. His first example shows a table for storing data about a rectangle, your classic shape-based example in programming. The rectangle class contains 2 float fields for the base and height of the rectangle, and then the third field is for the area, and it's a generated field. To specify the area field, you need 3 things. The first is the expression, and the expression tells the database how to form the contents. Django already has classes called F used to specify fields for other database goodness. So this expression just uses those and multiplies 2 F objects together, one for the base and one for the height. In addition to the expression, you also have to specify what kind of field the result is, and which in this case is also a float. And finally, there's a flag to say whether or not to actually store the result into the table. If you specify this as false, you'll get a virtual column, assuming your database supports that. And then for true, it actually calculates it and stores it. And if you change either of the values, it recalculates and changes the third. The latter can help if you actually want to index the column and do searches on it, which is the real power behind this tech. But I'll come back to that in a second. You can do far more than simple multiplication. Django ships with a series of database functions that you can use to create your expression. Paulo's article includes examples for power, sign, coast, concatenating strings, and some data manipulation functions as well, including things like getting at contents inside of JSON blobs. So beyond math, you can also do conditional expressions. So you do this with a case and when function. Combining these two allows you to check a value and conditionally change the generated field as a result. So the article uses an example where it checks whether one field is not null, and if so, marks an invoice as paid. So when the date gets filled in, it gets marked as paid. Before I wrap up, a quick word of warning. Although this is abstracted away for you from the database, not all databases handle all kinds of expressions. So this is definitely something you want to test out before you go to your boss and say, I know exactly how to solve this problem, because you might not. That being said, I've often had functions in my classes that produce these kinds of results, with the limitation being you can't query on them. By using a generated field, you can now push this kind of work into the database, which means it's sortable and queryable, which is kind of a superpower. So there's definitely use cases for it. And Paulo's article is a good introduction to it.
Yeah, it's very detailed.
Yeah, he's done a good job. There's lots of good examples in it. Yeah.
This week, I want to shine a spotlight on another Real Python video course. A main attraction for many Python developers is that it's a dynamically typed language. But if you're working with user-provided data or working with credentials, then data validation and managing settings will be vital for the reliability of your Python projects. And that's where a tool like Pydantic comes in. This course is titled Using Pydantic to Simplify Python Data Validation. It's based on a tutorial by Harrison Hoffman, and in the video course, Darren Jones takes you through working with data schemas using Pydantic's base model, writing custom validators for complex use cases, validating function arguments with Pydantic's validate call, and managing settings and configuring applications using Pydantic's settings. If you work with APIs, databases, credentials, or user settings in your Python projects, I think this course will be a good investment of your time. Real Python video courses are broken into easily consumable sections, and where needed, include code examples for the techniques shown. All lessons have a transcript, including closed captions. Check out the video course. You can find a link in the show notes, or you can find it using the enhanced search tool on realpython.com. We didn't have a discussion last week, but we have found one for this week. So did you want to introduce the discussion this week? Okay.
You may have heard of the Django Not Mentoring Program. It helps folks who want to contribute to Django by buddying them up with someone who knows the ins and outs of the framework. And Ryan Shelley has done 2 rounds of mentoring for the program, and he wrote up a blog post about what it means to be both a good mentor and a good mentee. There's nothing Django Not specific in it. That's just kind of what kicked it off, the idea. So he's got some advice for working with a mentor that starts off by telling you kind of have to have a clear goal. And he sort of contrasts this by giving 3 examples. The statement, I want to be a programmer, versus I want to try Python, versus I want to learn coding to help automate these things. And that third one here is kind of the key. It allows the mentor to give specific guidance and point you at things you can do. It also gives a point of conversation later. So if the mentor suggests that you go watch a specific video or listen to a specific podcast, then the next time you meet, then those can be things that you can discuss. What parts did you like? What parts didn't you like? What did you understand? Do you have questions, etc. Ryan also recommends scheduling yourself. So mentors are giving you their time. So make sure you do the things they're suggesting. And I know this may sound simple, but show up to your meetings. I've personally been in this situation a couple of times, and it doesn't take more than a few missed meetings, especially if there's no communication following up afterwards saying, oops, I screwed up. And it doesn't take long before I put a kibosh on a mentorship because, my time and your time, and I'm giving, and now all you're doing is taking. Anyways, Ryan's article then goes on to give advice to the mentor as well. My favorite part here is it's super important to remember it's their journey and not yours. So I've done some mentoring, but I've done a fair amount of coaching. And they're kind of similar things. And rule number one of coaching is always make sure the person wants to be coached. And that's kind of the same concept here, right? Like you try to figure out how you can actually help them. So what'd you think?
Yeah, I like it. And I like this program that Django Not's doing. If you're not familiar with it, when you basically set up your Django project, it starts with this little rocket ship. And so I think they've kind of always kept that theme going. And so I like that idea that the Django Knots themselves and the idea of like trying to figure out a way to take them through this program. And it made me think about mentoring generally. Like you already mentioned a couple of things, like how much of mentoring is being a coach. I think that might be the closest example. A coach they're not necessarily a teacher. They're not always going to take you individually step by step. They're going to give you things to do, exercises to do, like stuff to kind of push you in the direction and give you encouragement and answer your questions. But a teacher is going to maybe do much more of, really explaining the subject and, going down to brass tacks and stuff like that. And I feel like there's also this like being a therapist part that I think some people think of like as a part of the relationship. Oh, this is really hard. Like, yeah, it can be, and so forth. I haven't been a mentor in a lot of these circumstances as far as like programming. I think I've helped people here and there and, been like a coworker and, given advice and so forth. But I've never had that formality of it set up, maybe partly because of workplaces. I feel like this is becoming a workplace thing, which is actually really good in some circumstances. I think it can really help. I've worked as not only a teacher, an instructor, I've worked as a consultant, which has always been an interesting one for me, where I have been hired to tell people how to set up their recording studio or maybe their home equipment or whatever it is. And the more frustrating ones out of those are the ones where the people just basically say, well, just go set it up for me.
Right.
And to me, it's like, okay, but if you don't do this, I'm going to have to answer these questions like, I don't know how many times. And of course they're paying me and sometimes that's okay, but I'd rather see them progress and see them build it up and from there. And I feel like that's the case often with programming. As a teacher, again, I worked at Apple for a little while. I was like a trainer there. And I would go out of my way, and stuff like they try to stress it there, but not everybody would do it, to make sure that the person is driving. The person that you're trying to work with has got their hands on the keyboard and the mouse. And again, I've said this many times, like I always watch them do that. And I feel like you could do the same in a mentorship. We've had a couple interesting brushes into this, even kind of with the show briefly, like back in episode 4, right when we were starting, I had Martin on. He was talking about learning Python through errors and that errors are your friends. But we got into this whole side chain thing where he was working on a program he had been a part of this thing called Coding Nomads. And during the pandemic, they started a stay-at-home mentorship program. And I remember John Fincher, who's somebody else I had on the show very early on, got really involved in it. He had done mentoring at Microsoft. And so he was very interested in this idea. And I think he might still be doing stuff with Coding Nomads there. And I think you did some also.
Yeah, I volunteered with that. I took somebody under my wing, for want of a better phrase.
Okay.
The intent behind the program was for folks who had lost their jobs and were looking for typically a career change.
Okay.
So like the guy I was working with had some tech background, but it was more networking type, sysadmin type stuff.
Yeah.
And he wanted to pick up Python. And how that program worked was on their own, they were supposed to go off and do like Code Academy or read real Python articles or whatever. They were supposed to sort of go through those steps themselves. And essentially what you were doing was offering a couple hours a week of being a human being who could answer questions and provide guidance of, oh, if this is the area you're interested in, then try that area kind of thing. And it varied from week to week. Some weeks it was, he was stuck on something. So we'd go through and I'd like live code and say, okay, what do you think is going to happen next kind of stuff. And other weeks it would be, I tried to get him go the other way. Okay, you live code and okay, well, what are you going to tackle next and how are you going to do that? Right. One of the things he doesn't get into the article that I find is always kind of interesting is there's formal versions of this and there's informal versions of this, right? So like, I have never formally been mentored.
Yeah, I think that's my case too.
I've never signed up and had someone be my mentor. Yeah. But my God, has so much of my management skill come out of the accidental mentoring. It's like, that boss is so much better at this than I am. I have to watch what they're doing, right?
Yeah, sure. Or learn by what they've made a mistake doing. Yeah.
Yeah. And they spent time with me, talking to me and coaching me on, what I was doing right and what I was doing wrong. But it was just never I've never had the 2 hours a week, we're going to have this conversation kind of thing, right?
Right.
And I think both are useful and both are important. But I think it also changes a little bit of how you tackle stuff. So the advantage of the formal space is you can sort of kind of do that homeworky stuff and you can look at progress.
Right.
The informal can be useful also for, I find, with soft skills, right? So like, oh, I was in that meeting with you and, if you'd phrased this better, they wouldn't have started yelling, right? And that kind of stuff requires a little more to sort of to be present at events, whereas the kind that Ryan's talking about in this article is more sort of the formalized that happens kind of often in the coding space. Yeah.
Yeah. I think that having been a musician for a large part of my life, it's been interesting because I end up, as a traveling musician, you're meeting different personalities like every spot that you go and having to figure out, okay, well, how is this going to work at this venue and how do you interact? Having been a technician on the road is a whole other thing, like meeting this other staff,
right?
And so forth. So a lot of what you were saying, like I feel a lot of developers, engineers, what have you, they get a bit of this stuff in school and maybe they get a little bit of it in an internship, but I would love to see them do sales, work as a service industry person for a short little while. This idea of like shadowing that we've talked a couple times about, I think in other departments, sometimes they do. Management, obviously that's a common thing where, my wife has done a lot of that. She's been in banking and has been like a VP and so forth. And there's a lot of that there. I feel like that's structurally, but I feel, I guess, as a person entering development later in life, I didn't get to see those structures of like, well, okay, what is the mentorship program inside of an organization as far as like the whole idea of like a junior senior thing. I wonder about that. Did you see that sort of mentoring happening within teams of developers?
I think part of it is like the dynamic of how we work together has changed, right? So like you go back to like 1960s, 1970s style management, and it was very hierarchical and modern workplaces. There's still some of it, and people are people, and there's politics. Don't get me wrong.
Sure,
but it's much more likely that you're working on a small team, and that small team has a goal, and everyone's trying to figure out how to contribute that. Right?
The structure is flat.
Yeah, and so the flip side of it is I've seen organizations seem to be much more conscious of the idea of coaching and mentoring than they used to be. They understand that that's how you're going to grow it.
That's good.
A couple of the banks I've been dealing with have programs where it's like, okay, if you're fresh out of school, the first 2 years you are going to work in 5 departments, and we know it's part of it. Like you are going to work at this department for 5 or 6 months, and then you'll move on to a different department. And they're very, very intentional about, okay, you're going to spend some time in retail and you're going to spend some time in commercial, because those are 2 entirely different chunks of the bank and they do things completely differently.
Yeah.
And so it gives people that ability to better understand what's going on. I've seen a fair number of articles with companies that are talking about onboarding, that it's become a very common practice to go, okay, so here's your buddy. Any questions you have over the next 2 weeks, 3 weeks, whatever it is, start with your buddy. And again, that's that recognition that we're throwing you in the deep end. So at least point you at some other people who are also swimming so you can know which direction to swim in. I think that analogy's gone off the rails, but you get the general idea.
Yeah. I had Pablo on a couple years ago. We talked about guilds inside of, he works for Bloomberg. That's another area where I feel like that kind of mentoring is maybe happening within inside of a larger organization, and people were able to express interest in, like, maybe you worked in the finance area and you're interested in maybe learning a little more about programming or maybe using Python. You could go check out the Python guild. And it's the formal structure of mentoring, I think, is interesting, and mentoring programs, I think, are interesting, especially for something like open source, where it's like, this is this in some ways extracurricular thing to your life. You're like, I want to try to do this thing.
And the reason the Django's done it is, like, Django is it's a beast, right? Like, it's huge. And some of the choices, I love you guys, but some of the choices are questionable. Like, why does that live there? And the answer is history, right? But if you're starting out new and you didn't use Python 2.5 and Django 1.0, you might be scratching your head, right? And having somebody who can guide you and give you a bit of that history and point you at the right places to go, it's useful. I've got a buddy of mine who's been laid off recently, so he's tinkering in the background, and every once in a while I get the note of, okay, what Python libraries should I look up if I want to solve this problem, right? And it's not quite to the level of mentorship, but he's not asking for more help than that. But it's like, okay, I think I want to web scrape, and I want to do this, and I want to do that. I'm like, okay, try this article, this bit, this bit, this, right? And there's value in being able to have that, right? Because Google it and you'll get one answer. There's an article for everyone that says this one's better or that one's better, and it can be very, very overwhelming, right? So being able to tap on somebody's shoulder is there's value in that.
Yeah, I feel like there's so much pollution in the space of, like, any kind of hobby you might want to get into now. Like, I want to do woodworking. How should I start? And it's just going to be junk articles at the top of that have been SEO optimized. And you're like, can I just have someone give me? Yeah. And I think that YouTube is like kind of come in some places. Of course, you got to sort through that too. But maybe just having one person tell you, like, check out this person or what have you. Yeah, it's pretty handy.
Just a way to get that thin edge of the wedge in and get you somewhere to go from. Yeah.
Well, I think that takes us into projects. Speaking of web scraping, which you just mentioned briefly there, I have a web scraper, which is one of those things I like to talk about from time to time. And this one's called, I think it's pronounced Scrapling instead of Scrapling, but their subtitle is Lightning Fast Adaptive Web Scraping for Python. This project's by Kareem Shoyer, and they go by D4 Vinci on GitHub. The other sort of sub heading is dealing with failing web scrapers due to website changes, meet Scrapling. And so one of the ideas here is that you've set up this elaborate scraper, and it's like maybe running on a schedule to grab, I don't know, sports scores or do some kind of interesting thing. And then that website changes their structure. And now you got a lot of work ahead of yourself on how to fix this. The idea is that this could automatically adapt to that and find those same elements that it's been searching for in the past. It's pretty interesting. This is one of those projects that right away it worked. I love that. I was able to pip install it, get it working, and play around with the examples. And I that was actually very nice. It is a very smart navigation system where it really does the idea of trees, parent, children, siblings. You also can do CSS selectors and classes. So they talk about the speed so often in this thing, and they give like lots of charts. They pick on Beautiful Soup, which is, kind of a bit of an older library. This is definitely much, much speedier as far as like how it works inside of there. I'm intrigued by the auto matching feature. It has some similarities if you use something like Scrapy, which I've used to just grab things off a site and pull things out. It has some of that. I want to play with it a little bit more. I didn't have an example to play with. Scrapling. So what's yours?
My project this week's called httpdbg, spelt httpdbg, and it's by user Cleeby. I don't know how to pronounce that. Sure. CLEB with hyphens and capitalizations. So I'm not sure what you're supposed to do with that.
Yeah.
Anyways, when you've got code that interacts with a server through HTTPS because of the encryption, which normally is good, that means you can't easily see what's going on inside. And what this tool does is essentially provide you a man-in-the-middle attack that allows you to see what's going on. So the easiest way to use it is on the command line as a substitute for the Python interpreter. So say you've got a script that uses something like requests to go grab a page. I guess we're on that theme today, aren't we?
Yeah, we are. Yeah.
You can instead call that script using httpdbg that comes with the package. And once that interpreter is running, it also hosts a web page on your local machine on port 4909. So you can open up your browser and look at it, and it contains all the information about the calls that went through. So you can introspect, you can look at the headers, requests, responses, cookies, all those kinds of good things. And it also displays exception and stack information if your code falls over. People tell me this happens. I've never seen it myself, and it's kind of like a lightweight version of a networking tool. But because you're in full control on your box, you can essentially get around the encryption. There's also hooks for test code. So if instead you want to run a bunch of your tests instead of a script, it'll do that as well. It's got some other pieces for PyTest and things as well. So normally encryption's a good thing, but it can make debugging a pain. So a tool like this one can be very useful.
Nice.
And just before we go, I just want to remind people that we're always looking for projects to shout out about.
Yes.
We'll include a link to how you submit them off to PyCoders. We're always looking for good stuff. I go through fits and spurts where it's like, oh, there's plenty of good things and I've got a bunch of stuff queued. And the last couple of weeks, it's been very little. So if you're interested, it might be easier to get in the list right now because I don't have a big, long back queue. So submit stuff to us.
Yeah. Again, we feature all the stuff from the PyCoders newsletter. There are links there. I'll include an additional link here for you to submit stuff, but you can definitely check it out in the newsletter and all the stuff that we cover. And I got another minor request. We love when you review our podcast. Please do that on your favorite service.
We love when you give us a good review on your...
Please.
Yes.
Yeah. All right. Well, Chris, thanks again for bringing all these articles and projects and topics this week.
See you in a couple of weeks.
All right. And don't forget, installing Sentry is easy, and new users get 3 full months of the team plan, free with the code RealPython on sign up. I want to thank Christopher Trudeau for coming on the show again. And I want to thank you for listening to the Real Python podcast. Make sure that you click that follow button in your podcast player. And if you see a subscribe button somewhere, remember that the Real Python podcast is free. If you like the show, please leave us a review. You can find show notes with links to all the topics we spoke about inside your podcast player or at realpython.com/podcast. And while you're there, you can leave us a question or a topic idea. I've been your host, Christopher Bailey, and look forward to talking to you soon.